The digital timer on the workbench glowed a hostile red. 002 hours, 14 minutes, 31 seconds. It was counting down to high tide, to the precise moment of optimal darkness and minimal water current within the Toulon military harbor. It was also counting down to mission failure. Avner, the team's demolitions engineer, didn't look at the mission clock. His entire universe was a 3-inch square of green circuit board under the intense beam of a desk lamp. A single bead of sweat traced a path from his temple, down his jaw, and hung for a second before dropping onto the back of his hand. He didn't flinch. His fingers, steady as a surgeon's, guided a soldering iron toward a connection no bigger than a grain of sand. The target was a Class A, military-grade detonator timing circuit, sourced from a shell company in Belgium at a cost of $75,000. And it was dead. Completely, irrevocantly dead. Across the small, sparsely furnished room of the rented villa in La Seine-sur-Mer, Dan, the team leader, stood silhouetted against the window. He wasn't looking at the spectacular view of the French Riviera. He was looking at a dark shape in the harbor a mile away. The floodlit hulk of the constructions Navals et Industriels de la Méditerranée shipyard. Inside that shipyard, stored in a climate-controlled warehouse designated Bay 7, were 2 reactor cores. They were named Tammuz 1 and Tammuz 2. They were the heart of Saddam Hussein's dream. 1 week from now, they were scheduled to be loaded onto a freighter bound for Basra, Iraq. Dan checked his watch. He cross-referenced it with the tide chart pinned to the wall. He did this for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The action was tight, economical, a nervous tick disguised as diligence. He turned from the window. "Avner, status." Avner's voice was a low rasp, stripped of emotion. "The primary electronic timer is fried. A cascading failure from a faulty capacitor. Chinese knockoff component, probably. Saved the Belgians 10 cents. He didn't look up. "Can you fix it?" Dan asked. The question was a formality. He already knew the answer. "Fix it? No. I can't rebuild a microprocessor in a French kitchen. I can bypass it." Dan stepped closer. Leah, the team's surveillance expert, stopped her methodical packing of a go-bag and watched them both. The tension in the room thickened, became a physical presence. "Bypass to what?" Dan pressed. "To the backup," Avner said. He pointed the tip of his soldering tool to a much simpler, almost primitive-looking mechanism attached to the same board. The chemical timer, acid vial, copper wire, old school, reliable. But not precise, Dan stated. It wasn't a question. "No, not precise," Avner confirmed. "The electronic timer is accurate to the millisecond. This is a prayer. The acid eats the wire, the circuit closes, boom. But the corrosion rate depends on temperature. The water tonight is 2 degrees colder than the forecast. That adds maybe 4 minutes, maybe 8. It's a guess." Dan processed this. Their entire exfiltration plan was timed to the second. It relied on a series of synchronized events: the blast, the resulting confusion, the shift change of the gendarmerie patrol, the scheduled departure of a local fishing trawler they would blend in with. A delay of 8 minutes meant instead of slipping out in the chaos, they would be diving directly into the path of an incoming harbor patrol boat, alerted and actively searching. It was the difference between a ghost operation and a suicide mission. "What's the alternative?" Dan asked, his voice flat. Avner finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils pinioned by focus and fatigue. The alternative is we pack up, go home, and watch on CNN next year when Saddam announces he has the bomb. He gestured with the soldering iron at the crippled device. I can make it go boom. I just can't guarantee when. You have to make the call. Do we go? Dan looked at the clock. 02 hours, 11 minutes, 04 seconds. He looked at the tide chart. He looked at the dark shape in the harbor. The decision was his. The weight of a nation's future pressed down on the silence of that small room. The story of this moment, however, did not begin in a French villa with a broken timer. It began 3 years earlier, in a series of sterile briefing rooms in Tel Aviv, with a collection of grainy photographs and a terrifying calculation. The foundation of the crisis was laid not with troops or tanks, but with contracts and handshakes. In November 1975, French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac signed an agreement with Iraqi Vice President Saddam Hussein. The deal was worth over £1 billion. In exchange, France would provide Iraq with a complete nuclear facility. The centerpiece was a 70-megawatt Osiris-class research reactor. The French called it Osirak. The Iraqis, invoking a month of historic significance, named their program Tammuz. To the world, it was presented as a peaceful energy project, a step toward modernizing Iraq. But in the headquarters of Mossad, Israel's national intelligence agency, the analysis was stark and immediate. An Osiris-class reactor is a plutonium factory. It is wildly inefficient for generating electricity, but it is peerless at irradiating uranium fuel rods, the first step in creating weapons-grade plutonium. The deal included the delivery of 72 kilograms of 93% enriched weapons-grade uranium. Enough, an internal Israeli Atomic Energy Commission report concluded, for at least 5 nuclear bombs of the Nagasaki type. The intelligence assessments that crossed the desk of Prime Minister Menachem Begin were unequivocal. Saddam Hussein was not building a power plant. He was building a bomb, and he had publicly, repeatedly, declared his intention to use it to burn half of Israel. The geopolitical chessboard was set. Israel, still haunted by the surprise attack of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, viewed Saddam's nuclear ambition as an existential threat, a second Holocaust in the making. France, prioritizing its economic and diplomatic ties with the Arab world, saw a lucrative commercial opportunity and refused to bow to Israeli pressure. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter, was focused on non-proliferation treaties and diplomacy, unwilling to sanction France or take direct action. Israel was alone. The problem fell to the one organization designed to operate in that solitary, high-stakes space: the Mossad. The mission's genesis came from a human intelligence asset, codenamed Dr. Yahia. He was an Iraqi nuclear physicist working on the project in Baghdad. Over a period of 18 months, he had been cultivated by a Mossad Katsa, a field officer in Rome. His reports, smuggled out on microfilm hidden inside toothpaste tubes, painted a chilling picture. He confirmed the existence of a secret parallel program run by the Iraqi military, focused entirely on weaponization. He detailed their struggles with trigger mechanisms and their attempts to acquire Krytron switches on the black market. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle arrived in January 1979. Dr. Yahia reported that the French were nearing completion of the 2 reactor cores. These weren't just components. They were the irreplaceable hearts of the reactor. Once installed in Iraq, destroying them without causing a catastrophic radioactive disaster would be nearly impossible. The report landed on the desk of Mir Dagan, a rising star in Mossad's operations division. Dagan was not a diplomat. A veteran of the Sayeret Matkal Special Forces and founder of the controversial Rimon undercover unit, his entire career was built on a simple philosophy: it is better to be feared than to be loved. He had led kill or capture missions in the Gaza Strip disguised as an Arab local, dismantling terror cells with brutal efficiency. His skill was seeing the direct, physical solution to a strategic problem. He saw the report and bypassed the entire chain of diplomatic hand-wringing. He walked into the office of Mossad Director Yitzhak Hofi and laid it on his desk. His recommendation was not a memo. It was a battle plan. "We cannot wait for them to be installed," Duggan argued. "We cannot wait for them to be fueled. We must cut the head off the snake in its cradle." The cradle was La Seine-sur-Mer, France. Director Hofi, a more cautious and methodical man, saw the immense risk. A failed operation on French soil would be a diplomatic catastrophe, potentially destroying Israel's relationship with its only European weapons supplier. But Duggan was relentless. He presented a multi-tiered plan. Phase 1. Sabotage the components before they ship. If that failed, Phase 2. Assassinate the key Iraqi and European scientists. If that failed, Phase 3. Military action, a direct airstrike. Hofi took the plan to Prime Minister Begin. Begin, a man who had lost his entire family in the Holocaust, listened intently. He understood existential threats in his bones. After Dagon's presentation, he looked at his military chiefs and his intelligence director and said 2 words: Phase 1. Authorize it. The mission, codenamed Operation Sphinx, was born. The players were assembled not based on rank, but on a history of successful, high-risk, deniable operations. The man chosen to lead the team on the ground was codenamed Dan. 42 years old, a veteran of the 1967 and 1973 wars. His defining achievement was commanding the extraction of a high-value Syrian defector from the heart of Damascus in 1977. A mission that involved hiding the man in a modified fuel tanker for 3 days. His skill was improvisation under extreme pressure. The ability to make cold, logical decisions while his plan disintegrated around him. His second in command was Avner, the demolitions expert. A chemical engineer by training, he was recruited into Mossad's Caesarea division after he developed a new type of linear-shaped charge that could cut through 6 inches of hardened steel with minimal collateral blast. His past achievement was the successful sabotage of a shipment of advanced Soviet guidance systems in the port of Alexandria, using a limpet mine he designed himself. His critical skill was the creation of bespoke explosive devices for specific, unique targets. Leah was the surveillance and infiltration specialist. She spoke fluent French with a Parisian accent, a skill she had honed during a 4-year operation where she posed as a university student to map the social and professional networks of PLO operatives in Paris. She could defeat most commercial alarm systems and was a master of disguise and social engineering. Her greatest success was planting a listening device inside the office of a Syrian intelligence chief by seducing his male secretary, a feat that required 3 months of meticulous planning and psychological manipulation. Running the operation from a safe house in Paris was Yossi, the logistical Katza. His job was to build the infrastructure of the mission, procure the untraceable vehicles, rent the safe houses, create the forged documents, and manage the legends or cover stories for the team. His masterpiece was Operation Damocles in the 1960s, where he created an entire fake German import-export company, complete with offices, staff, and a year's worth of fabricated business records, all to provide cover for Mossad agents targeting German scientists working for Egypt. Together, they formed the tip of the spear. Their chessboard was the southern coast of France. Their target was two colossal 60-ton cylinders of stainless steel and zirconium sitting in Bay 7 of a high-security French industrial port. Their deadline was April 7, 1979, the scheduled shipping date. The intelligence failure that triggered the mission was, in fact, an intelligence success. Dr. Yahia's report. It proved diplomacy had failed. It proved the threat was imminent. It transformed a strategic problem into a tactical emergency. The problem was simple. 2 reactor cores in France. The solution had to be just as simple. Those cores could never leave. The execution of Operation Sphinx began with the meticulous creation of a lie. Leah and Yossi arrived in France 6 weeks before the operational window. They were not spies. They were advanced scouts for a newly formed entity, the Mediterranean Ecological Research Group. Yossi, leveraging his expertise, had officially registered the company in Luxembourg, a jurisdiction known for its corporate opacity. They had a letterhead, business cards, and a bank account seeded with funds wired through a labyrinth of shell corporations. Leah, assuming the identity of Dr. Annelise Dubois, a marine biologist from the University of Geneva, began scouting locations near Toulon. She wasn't looking for scenic beauty. She was looking for a specific set of tactical advantages. She needed a property with direct line of sight to the CNIM shipyard, a private dock or easy access to the water, and crucial geographic isolation to mask their activities. She found the perfect spot, a slightly run-down villa for rent in the hills of La Seine-sur-Mer. It had a crumbling stone wall for privacy and a rickety wooden staircase that led down to a secluded rocky cove. From the upstairs balcony, using a standard bird-watching telescope, she could monitor every vessel entering and leaving the shipyard's primary channel. For 2 weeks, Leah played the part of the eccentric academic. She rented a small Peugeot, drove into town for groceries, and sat on the public beach taking water samples in full view of the locals. She established a baseline of normalcy. Dan and Avner arrived 2 weeks later, posing as her research assistants. Their luggage was standard tourist fare, but 2 large, heavy-duty Pelican cases were shipped separately as oceanographic survey equipment to a holding company Yossi had set up. Inside were not water quality sensors, but the tools of their real trade. Closed-circuit rebreathers, specialized night vision goggles adapted for underwater use, and compact underwater propulsion vehicles, diver scooters, and packed in hermetically sealed, inert containers were the components for 5 custom-designed shaped charges. The technology was central to the mission's philosophy of plausible deniability. Avner hadn't built a bomb. He had built a surgical tool. Each device consisted of a precisely molded cone of RDX TNT composite, encased in a waterproof, magnetically attachable housing. The principle of a shaped charge is to focus the energy of the explosion into a narrow, high-velocity jet of molten metal. This jet wouldn't cause a massive, building-leveling explosion. Instead, it was designed to punch a clean, softball-sized hole through the thick, stainless steel casing of the reactor core. The goal wasn't to vaporize the cores, but to rupture them, rendering them structurally unsound and useless. Such damage might even be initially mistaken for a manufacturing defect or an industrial accident, buying the team precious time to escape the country. The rebreathers were equally critical. Standard scuba gear releases a constant stream of bubbles, easily visible on the surface, especially to a night patrol with a searchlight. Closed-circuit rebreathers recycle the diver's exhaled air, scrubbing the carbon dioxide and injecting a precise amount of oxygen. No bubbles. Total silence. The team became aquatic ghosts. For the next 3 weeks, the villa became an intensive training and surveillance camp. During the day, they maintained their cover. They'd take their small inflatable boat out, ostensibly to study seagrass beds, but in reality, to map the currents and thermal layers of the harbor. At night, the real work began. Leah, using her telescope and a high-powered directional microphone, built a detailed log of the shipyard's security protocols. She mapped the patrol routes of the guards, the timing of their shifts, the dead zones in the CCTV camera coverage. She noted that Guard Post 3, near the water's edge of Bay 7, was frequently unmanned between Udro 2 Adergaro and Derho 2:15 a.m., while the guard took an unsanctioned coffee break. Dan and Avner conducted practice dives every night in the cove below the villa, honing their underwater navigation skills in complete darkness, guided only by their wrist compasses and a pre-memorized map of the harbor floor. They practiced attaching the magnetic charges to a submerged metal plate Avner had brought, timing themselves until the entire process took less than 90 seconds. Their communication was a masterpiece of clandestine tradecraft. They had no radios, no phones. Their only link to Yossi in Paris was a device disguised as a pager. Once every 24 hours, at a prearranged, randomly shifting time, the device would beep. Leah would then use a standard shortwave radio to tune to a specific frequency, the broadcast of a number station from Cyprus. The broadcast was meaningless noise to anyone else, but embedded within the strings of numbers, read by a monotone female voice, were coded instructions. A sequence beginning with 773 might mean, "Mission is green, proceed as planned." 401 could mean, "Compromise suspected, abort and evacuate." It was slow, one way, but utterly secure. The plan they formulated was elegant in its simplicity. On the night of April 6th, under the cover of a new moon, Dan and Avner would enter the water from the cove. They would use their underwater scooters to cover the 1-mile distance to the shipyard's pier. They would navigate to Bay 7, surface in the shadow of the loading dock, and wait for the 02 a.m. coffee break Leah had identified. During that 15-minute window, they would slip under the dock, attach 5 charges to the 2 cores stored inside the warehouse, which was open to the water on one side for loading, and set the timers for 03:15 a.m. They would then retreat, rendezvous with Leah on a deserted stretch of coast road, and drive through the night to a second safe house near the Spanish border. Yossi would have new passports and a car with Spanish plates waiting. Then, the first major complication arose. Its name was Officer Dubois, a local gendarme, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. He was bored. La Seine-sur-Mer was a quiet town. A group of foreign scientists with high-end gear was the most interesting thing to happen all year. He first made contact during one of Leah's water sampling sessions on the public beach. He was polite, friendly, just making his rounds. He asked about her research. Leah, in her role as Dr. Dubois, launched into a prepared monologue about invasive Caulerpa seaweed, a genuine ecological issue in the Mediterranean. She used the correct scientific terminology. She showed him her faked data charts. She thought she had handled it perfectly. But Dubois was sharper than she anticipated. A week later, he showed up at the villa, unannounced. "Just happened to be in the neighborhood," he said, a folksy smile on his face. "Brought you some croissants from the patisserie in town, the best ones." Leah's heart hammered. but she smiled back, inviting him in for coffee. Dan and Avner were upstairs, supposedly analyzing data. In reality, they were cleaning and prepping the rebreathers. Leah had to keep Dubois in the kitchen. He commented on the powerful telescope on the balcony. "For watching birds, yes?" he asked innocently. "Of course," Leah replied smoothly. "The migratory patterns in this region are fascinating." "Ah," Dubois said, stirring his coffee. "But it seems always pointed at the shipyard. Are the seagulls there particularly interesting?" The question was a dagger wrapped in pleasantry. Leah felt a chill. He knew, or he suspected. She had to deflect, but not too aggressively. "The heat shimmer from the metal roofs creates unique thermal updrafts," she improvised, her mind racing. "It affects the low-altitude flight paths. It's a secondary aspect of our atmospheric study." It was gibberish, but it was scientific-sounding gibberish. Dubois just nodded, sipped his coffee, and changed the subject. He stayed for 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. When he left, Leah collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. They were being watched. The baseline of normalcy had been compromised. Dan made an immediate decision. All daytime activity ceased. The boat was covered. The telescope was put away. They would now be ghosts, even in their own safe house, only moving at night. The risk profile of the mission had just doubled. But the deadline was immovable. The cores were still scheduled to ship. They had to proceed. Then came the second setback, far more critical than a curious cop. It happened on the afternoon of April 6th, T-minus 10 hours to the mission launch. Avner was conducting the final systems check on the 5 explosive packages. He armed one of the detonators for a diagnostic test. The small LED indicator, which should have blinked green, stayed dark. He tried a second. Nothing. A third. Dead. He methodically disassembled the first unit, his movements precise and economical. Under a magnifying glass, he found it. A hairline fracture in the primary capacitor of the electronic timing circuit. A manufacturing defect, invisible to the naked eye, present in all 5 units. He was holding 5 state-of-the-art, $75,000 paperweights. This was the moment that brought them to the hostile red glow of the mission clock in the kitchen. This was the moment Avner explained the only remaining option. Bypassing the sophisticated electronic brain and relying on the primitive, unpredictable chemical backup. The acid vial. A mechanism so archaic it was barely taught anymore. A relic from a bygone era of espionage. Dan listened to Avner's assessment. An 8-minute variable, it was a lifetime. His mind mapped out the consequences. An 8-minute delay meant their exfiltration car, driven by Leah, would be waiting on the coast road at the exact moment that the first police and military vehicles would be screaming toward the shipyard in response to the blast. It meant his and Avner's escape route from the water would be lit up like a football stadium by patrol boat searchlights. He weighed the options. Abort, and Saddam gets his reactor cores. Proceed, and the risk of capture or death for his team increased tenfold. He looked at Avner. He looked at Leah. He saw no fear in their eyes, only resolve. He had chosen them for this very reason. "Bypass them," Dan said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're going. Leah," he turned to her, "change the exfil plan. We're not using the road. It'll be saturated. We go to Plan B, the sunken rendezvous." Plan B was a contingency so risky they had barely discussed it. It involved Dan and Avner, after planting the charges, swimming not to the coast, but 3 miles in the opposite direction, out into the open sea. to a pre-designated GPS coordinate. There, they would have to tread water in the cold darkness, hoping a neutral sailboat, chartered by Yossi and manned by another Mossad team, would find them before hypothermia did. It was a desperate gamble. "It's a 2-hour swim post exertion in cold water with no scooters," Leah said, stating the brutal facts. "You'll be exhausted." "Find another way," Dan said simply. Avner didn't hesitate. "I'll rig the scooter batteries. I can cross-wire them in series. It'll give us enough power for the outbound leg, but it will burn out the motors. It's a one-way trip. We'll have to ditch them." Dan nodded. "Do it." He looked at the clock. 1 hour, 48 minutes, 22 seconds. The plan was in pieces. Their cover was strained. Their technology was failing. But the mission was still alive. It would be carried on the backs of their training, their nerve, and a desperate, improvised plan born in the final 2 hours before stepping into the abyss. The night of April 6, 1979, was cold, the sky a blanket of impenetrable black. The new moon offered no comfort, no sliver of light. It was a perfect night for ghosts. At 00:30 a.m., Dan and Avner, clad in black neoprene wetsuits, stood in the rocky cove below the villa. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. Leah stood with them, a shadowy figure holding 2 rebreather units. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks. There were no final words of encouragement. There was no ceremony. They were professionals. Leah helped Avner secure his rebreather, her movements practiced and efficient. She then turned to Dan, checking the seals on his mask herself. For a brief second, their eyes met. It was a look that conveyed everything that could not be spoken. Trust, fear, the shared weight of their purpose. Dan gave her a single, sharp nod. It meant go. Leah turned and melted back into the shadows, beginning her long, circuitous route to the new, far more dangerous exfiltration point. Dan and Avner fitted their dive masks and mouthpieces. The world narrowed to the sound of their own breathing, artificially calm and rhythmic, courtesy of the rebreathers. They did a final check of the gear strapped to their bodies. The 5 magnetic charges, each weighing 20 pounds, a dive knife, a compass, and a waterproofed flashlight. They slipped into the dark, frigid water without a splash. The cold was a physical shock, a brutal clench around the chest. They ignored it. They activated the underwater scooters Avner had modified. The small propellers whirred almost silently, pulling them away from the shore and down into the blackness of the Mediterranean. They leveled off at a depth of 15 feet. Navigation was a matter of pure training. There were no landmarks, only the green, glowing needle of the compass on Dan's wrist and the mission timer on Avner's. Dan led, keeping a steady pace. Avner followed, his eyes scanning the dark water around them. The 1-mile journey to the shipyard was a sensory deprivation exercise. There was nothing to see but the faint disturbance in the water from Dan's fins. Nothing to hear but the hum of the scooters and their own breathing. It was a universe of cold, pressure, and forward momentum. 01:27 a.m. They reached the outer perimeter of the shipyard. They cut the motors on the scooters and glided the last 50 yards in silence, using their fins. The massive, dark shapes of the piers loomed above them, blotting out the starless sky. They were in enemy territory. 01:41 m. Dan surfaced slowly, carefully, in the deep shadow of a concrete piling. He scanned the dock. He saw the dim light from the guardhouse for Bay 7, about 100 yards away. No movement. He gave a low, 2-click signal with a shielded penlight. Avner surfaced beside him. 01:50 a.m. They heard the faint sound of a patrol boat engine. Dan pulled Avner back under the pier. They clung to the slimy, barnacle-encrusted concrete as the boat passed directly overhead, its searchlight cutting a brilliant white cone across the surface of the water just feet from their hiding spot. The vibrations of its engine resonated through their bones. The light swept past. The sound of the engine faded. They waited another full minute, motionless, before resurfacing. 01:59 a.m. Leah's surveillance had been perfect. As if on cue, the light in the guard shack for Bay 7 flicked off. The guard emerged, stretched, and began his slow walk toward the main canteen for his coffee. The 15-minute window was open. "Go," Dan whispered. They slipped out from under the pier and swam the final distance to the loading bay. Bay 7 was a massive, 3-sided structure. Its fourth side open to the water to allow for direct loading onto ships. Inside, shrouded in canvas tarps, were their targets. 2 colossal cylindrical forms, Tammuz 1 and Tammuz 2. They looked like sleeping giants. 02:04 a.m. They worked in silent unison. Dan swam to the first core, Avner to the second. Dan pulled the first 20-pound charge from his harness. He located the pre-designated spot, a reinforced structural joint on the core's housing, identified from blueprints Dr. Yahia had supplied. He scraped away a small patch of marine algae and attached the device. The powerful magnets clamped onto the steel with a dull, heavy thud that seemed deafening in the silence. He attached a second charge to the other side of the same core. 02:07. Avner was having a problem. His second charge wouldn't stick. He ran his hand over the surface. A patch of thick, industrial anti-fouling paint, unexpectedly slick and bumpy, was preventing the magnets from getting a clean purchase. He pulled his dive knife. He began scraping at the paint, the metallic screech of the blade against the hull echoing horribly in the enclosed space. Every sound was a potential death sentence. Dan froze, scanning the dock. Nothing. He swam to Avner's side. 02:09 a.m. Dan grabbed the charge while Avner scraped frantically. The paint came off in thick, rubbery strips. Finally, Avner nodded. Dan positioned the charge. Another heavy thud. 4 down, 1 to go. Dan took the fifth and final charge, designed to be the coup de grace, and secured it to the cooling system intake of Tammuz 1. 02:11 a.m. All 5 charges were in place. Dan and Avner met between the 2 cores. Their flashlights, shielded to emit only a pinprick of light, found the activation switches on the charges. This was Avner's moment of truth. He took a deep breath. He couldn't set a precise time. He could only start the chemical reaction. He pulled the small safety pin from the first device and twisted the activation dial. Inside the device, a thin glass vial shattered, releasing a drop of hydrofluoric acid onto a coiled copper wire. The prayer had begun. He repeated the action 4 more times. Each twist of the dial was an irreversible act of war. 02:14 a.m. The window was closing. The guard would be returning any second. They slipped back into the water just as the light in the guardhouse flicked back on. They had made it with less than a minute to spare. They retrieved their scooters. Dan set his compass for the new bearing. Open sea. They switched the motors on. The override Avner had jury-rigged worked. The scooters surged with power, pulling them away from the shipyard at high speed. They were committed now. There was no turning back. 02:45. A mile out to sea, Avner's scooter sputtered and died. The motor was burned out. A minute later, Dan's did the same. They ditched the useless equipment, watching it sink into the black depths. Now, it was just two men, 3 miles from their rendezvous point, in the open, choppy waters of the Mediterranean. The swim was a brutal, soul-crushing ordeal. The adrenaline of the infiltration was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing fatigue. The cold, which they had ignored for hours, began to seep into their bones. Their movements became slower, less efficient. Hypothermia was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a creeping certainty. Dan focused on his compass, on the rhythm of his strokes. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. He forced all thought from his mind, except the bearing. Avner swam beside him, his form a dark shape in Dan's peripheral vision. They were two machines, fueled by a dwindling supply of warmth and willpower. 03:19 a.m. Back in La Seine-sur-Mer, the chemical reactions reached their conclusion. The acid ate through the last strand of copper wire in the first detonator. The circuit closed. An electrical charge flashed to the primary explosive. For a microsecond, the RDX composite in the first shaped charge compressed under the force of its own detonation wave. Then, it unleashed its focused energy. A jet of molten steel, traveling at over 20,000 feet per second, struck the hull of Thomas 1. It punched a perfectly round hole through the 2-inch thick casing as if it were cardboard. A fraction of a second later, the other 4 charges fired in a chaotic, unsynchronized volley. The result was not one large explosion, but a series of 5 distinct, violent impacts. From the outside, it was a muffled, percussive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. Inside Bay 7, it was catastrophic. The structural integrity of both reactor cores was destroyed. Zirconium casings were ruptured. Cooling pipes were severed. The hearts of Saddam's nuclear program were fatally wounded. The quiet French night was shattered. Lights flashed on all over the shipyard. Sirens began to wail, a sound that carried faintly across the water to the 2 exhausted swimmers. They didn't look back. They just kept swimming. The immediate fallout was precisely the blend of chaos and confusion Mossad had intended. The first reports from the CNIM shipyard to the French authorities were bewildered. There had been an explosion, no, several explosions, in Bay 7. It was initially assumed to be an industrial accident, perhaps a gas cylinder detonation. But when the first responders entered the smoke-filled warehouse, the truth was both more subtle and more severe. The warehouse itself was largely intact. A few windows were shattered, and the canvas tarps were shredded. But the 2 priceless reactor cores were ruined. They were pockmarked with deep, circular holes. An expert from the French Atomic Energy Commission, flown in overnight, took one look at the damage and knew instantly. This was not an accident, he stated grimly to the assembled DST officials. This was a surgical strike. The French government was enraged. The attack was a profound embarrassment, a violation of their national sovereignty. Prime Minister Raymond Barre publicly condemned the cowardly act of sabotage and vowed to find the perpetrators. The DST, France's elite counterintelligence agency, launched a massive investigation. They swarmed La Seine-sur-Mer, interviewing hundreds of people. They quickly found the abandoned villa. They discovered the indentations in the carpet where the workbench had been, and a single, microscopic drop of solder on the kitchen floor. Officer Dubois, the observant local gendarme, became a key witness, providing a detailed description of Dr. Annelise Dubois and her male companions. the legend of the Mediterranean Ecological Research Group was exposed as a fabrication. The blame game began immediately. Iraq publicly accused the Zionist entity, pointing to Israel's vocal opposition to their nuclear program. In Tel Aviv, the Prime Minister's office issued a terse, flat denial. Israel has no connection to this incident, the statement read. Then, the masterstroke of plausible deniability was deployed. The day after the explosion, a letter arrived at the offices of the Reuters news agency in Paris. It was from a group no one had ever heard of, the Groupe des écologistes français. In the letter, they claimed responsibility for the bombing, stating they had acted to prevent the introduction of a nuclear menace into the Mediterranean basin. The DST knew it was a fabrication, a ghost, but it muddied the waters perfectly. In the international press, the story became about radical environmentalists, not state-sponsored sabotage. The narrative was successfully diverted. While the world debated, the operational team was fighting for their lives. At 4:52 a.m., after swimming for more than 2 hours in the open sea, Dan's strength gave out. His strokes faltered. The first signs of advanced hypothermia were setting in. Uncontrollable shivering, mental confusion. Avner grabbed his harness, keeping his head above water. They were floating, two dead weights in an unforgiving ocean, their hopes dwindling with every passing minute. At 5:10 a.m. they saw it. A faint light, bobbing on the waves. It was the masthead light of a 40-foot sailboat, the Calypso IIs, chartered by Yossi and manned by 2 agents from Mossad's Naval Commando Unit, Shayetet 13. Following the GPS coordinates of the emergency plan, they had been searching for almost an hour. They hauled the 2 semi-conscious men aboard, wrapped them in thermal blankets, and forced hot, sweet tea down their throats. Leah was on board. She had made her own perilous journey, navigating back roads to a different port and being picked up by the same boat hours earlier. The team was whole. As the sun rose over the French coast, the Calypso II was already well on its way to its final destination, a rendezvous with an Israeli Navy missile boat in international waters. Operation Sphinx was over. The mission was a complete success. The reactor cores were so badly damaged that the French engineers declared them irreparable. It would take at least 2 years to build new ones. In the Mossad Operations Center, there was quiet, profound satisfaction. They had achieved their objective without losing a single person, and without leaving a single piece of forensic evidence that could be traced back to the State of Israel. But the story does not end there. The final, crucial revelation of Operation Sphinx recontextualizes the entire event, transforming it from a standalone act of sabotage into the opening move of a much larger, more audacious chess game. The 2-year delay that Avner's shaped charges purchased was not just a victory. It was a strategic opportunity. Mir Dagan and the Israeli leadership had never truly believed that Phase 1 would be the final solution. They knew Saddam's ambition was relentless. The sabotage in France was designed to do one thing above all else: buy time. And they used that time brilliantly. While the French and Iraqis wrangled over new contracts and began the slow process of rebuilding the cores, a very different kind of construction was taking place in Israel. The Israeli Air Force had just begun receiving its first squadron of brand-new, American-made F-16 Fighting Falcons. In the Negev desert, Israeli intelligence, using blueprints and satellite photos, built a life-size replica of what the finished Osirak reactor complex in Iraq would look like. IAF pilots, led by a brilliant commander named Iftash Spector, began practicing bombing runs on this replica. They developed new low-level flying techniques to evade Jordanian and Saudi radar. They calculated fuel consumption to the last drop for a mission that would take them to the very edge of their plane's operational range. They wargamed every possible contingency. The sabotage of 1979 was the starting gun. It gave the IAF the 2-year window they desperately needed to prepare for what they always knew would be the inevitable conclusion: a military strike. On June 7, 1981, 2 years and 2 months after the explosion in La Seine-sur-Mer, 8 Israeli F-16s took off and flew 600 miles across hostile territory. In a strike lasting less than 2 minutes, they dropped 16 2,000-pound bombs on the newly completed and about to be fueled Osirak reactor outside Baghdad, reducing it to rubble. That mission, known as Operation Opera, was only possible because of the delay. The final, hidden legacy of Operation Sphinx was this: the silent, cold, underwater work of 2 divers in a French harbor made the thunderous, fiery destruction of Saddam's nuclear dream in the Iraqi desert an operational reality. The quiet prayer of a chemical timer in France was the long-range forecast for a storm of steel in Iraq. It was a masterclass in strategic patience, proving that sometimes the most effective act of war is not to win the battle, but simply to buy enough time to prepare for the one that truly matters.